Welcome to the Places and Profiles podcast, the podcast that explores the issues, stories, and people that have shaped places into what they are today. Here's your host, Adam Kamek.
If you're interested in starting a podcast, then Podcaster's Paradise is an invaluable resource for you. With step-by-step video tutorials, a tremendous number of resources and templates, and daily support, Podcaster's Paradise is by far the most important resource for any aspiring podcaster. Plus, if you join Podcaster's Paradise through my link, then I will promote your podcast on the show. Check out Podcaster's Paradise at placesandprofiles.com/paradise. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Places and Profiles podcast. Today I'm speaking with Tony Payan about key figures and issues in Mexican politics, key issues in U.S.-Mexico relations and how relations have been affected by Mexican politics, and the 2024 Mexican presidential election. Tony is the François and Edward Georgian Fellow for Mexico Studies and Director of the Center for the United States and Mexico at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. He's also Professor of Social Sciences at the Universidad Autónoma de Ciudad Juárez in Ciudad Juárez, Chihuahua, Mexico. You can follow his work at Payan Tony on X, previously known as Twitter. For more information, please check out the show notes page for this episode at placesandprofiles.com/12. Tony, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Adam. Happy to be here.
Well, I greatly appreciate you coming on and spending your time with me today. So since Mexican politics is at the core of what we're discussing, let's just start with an overview because probably the majority of the listeners are Americans, and they probably don't know some of the intricacies and some of the issues at hand in Mexico today. So let's just start with an overview of major Mexican political parties. What are the major parties in Mexico, and what sorts of things have they advocated for?
The political party landscape in Mexico is a little bit different than that of the United States. There are officially in 2023, 7 different political parties in Mexico. They've actually coalesced into 2 different coalitions, but at the end of the day, there's 7 of them. I think the right-left spectrum that we often talk about between the Democrats and the Republicans doesn't really apply to Mexico. I mean, perhaps on the right, you got the PAN or PAN. It's a more traditional conservative right of center political party. Then you have the PRI, which governed Mexico for about 70 years in the 20th century. That's, I would say, a centrist political party. And then you have the PRD, which is a slightly more traditional left of center political party. It's a very small party today, even though they used to be quite large. And then you have the Green Party, which is not a Green Party at all. In fact, the Green Party in Mexico, also known as PVEM, doesn't really belong to the coalition of green political parties around the world because their policies are really not green. They're a very opportunistic political party that often attaches itself to the winning party so that they can be part of the ruling coalition. And they switch sides back and forth, right and left, depending on the moment. And then you got a Workers' Party, which is kind of an old Leninist, communist, leftist party, sort of stuck in the middle of the 20th century, not really a large party, but with a very specific following. And then you got the MC, which is a more modern political party, but I'm not sure that they're right or left. They tend to have a lot of the positions, similar positions to that of the PAN and the PRD, perhaps. They're a younger party populated by very young politicians. And then, of course, you got Morena, which is the currently governing party. Mr. López Obrador is the president's party. And that is a very strange amalgamation of old PRI members, some PAN members who have exited, some PRD. In fact, Morena was born out of the PRD, but it has a lot of the characteristics of the PRI in the 20th century. So I would say that to understand the political party landscape in Mexico, you really need to know a little bit of history and how these political parties have evolved. I would be kind of hesitant to use the right-left spectrum to classify them. It's a complex landscape of political parties. But the important thing for the audience to know is that today we have essentially two coalitions. On the one hand, the president's political party, Morena, allied with the Workers' Party and the Green Party, nominating one specific person, Claudia Sheinbaum. And then on the other side, we have the PAN, PRD, and PRI, also in a coalition known as the Frente Amplio. And they have, chosen Xochitl Galvez as the other person. And then kind of floating around, still undecided, the MC or Citizens Movement Party, which is still, trying to figure out where it's going to go, one side or the other, or go alone. That's about the landscape as it stands today.
Now, historically, the PRI dominated Mexican politics for a long time during the 20th century. Then eventually, Vicente Fox, as a member of the PAN, was elected president. Calderon, also member of PAN, Felipe Calderon succeeding him. Then Enrique Peña Nieto as a member of the PRI. And now we have AMLO, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, as a member of Morena. So what brought about this shift where PRI was the dominant political force, then it went to PAN, back to PRI, and now Morena is the ruling party in Mexico? What brought about these changes where it went from one party dominating at the presidential level to, in more recent decades, switching back and forth between different parties and coalitions?
Well, I think the decay of the PRI, which dominated Mexican politics between the 1930s through about 2000, came about because the Mexican development model, which was the known as the substitute industrialization model, ISI, from the 30s to the 70s, I guess, sort of reached its peak, and Mexico began to experience a kind of a stagnation in growth by the very early 1980s, and the party became quite corrupt, and there was a big movement for democratization in the 1980s. The middle class rose against the political party, and at that time, the PAN was around. The PAN is actually the oldest political party, founded in 1939, and it became kind of the one institution where most people concentrated their efforts, their organizational efforts, to dethrone the PRI. So that lasted through the 80s. By the 1990s, there was some kind of political compromise between the PRI and the PAN to sort of open the political system. And that began the transition, the democratic transition in Mexico. We're talking 1994, 1997, to the point that most people voted for Vicente Fox by the year 2000. And that's when the Mexican political system really opened up. So I guess the end of the PRI has taken a very long time. It began back in the early 80s, and it's still around. It's only got two states. It only governs two states today. They're not very large states, and it just lost the largest state in Mexico. It lost them in the elections this summer. And so it's now almost a smaller political party. It's not a minor political party in the sense that the PRI still has about, 18 to 20% loyalty in the Mexican electorate, but it's obviously not a majority party any longer. Mr. Lopez Obrador, who founded Morena in 2014, was a member of the PRD, a party founded in 1988. And before that, he was actually a member of the PRI. Almost everyone was a member of the PRI in the 20th century. It was the only political party, was a hegemonic political party. So Mexico has taken a very circuitous route towards democracy. It's taken a very long time. I would say that it's not even consolidated yet. It's more of an electoral democracy with some real serious issues. And Mr. Lopez Obrador founded his own political party, Morena, in 2014, won the elections. What I think it's important to note here is that for about 35 to 40 years, Mexicans have shown that they can vote, and they can vote the rascals out. They've shown it by defeating the PRI in 1997. That was a midterm election where the PRI lost the majority in Congress. Then they lost the presidency in 2000. In every midterm election, the party in power has lost the election, and that includes Morena in 2021. And I think Morena is held together by Mr. López Obrador because it's an amalgamation of very strange folk, some from the PRI, some from the PRD, and some Trotskyists, Leninists, and some rather conservative individuals. So I don't think that party will survive Mr. López Obrador's leaving office. It'll probably begin to splinter. But at the end of the day, I think the point is that the Mexican electorate has proven to be very effective at using elections to ensure a certain political balance, a political equilibrium in Mexico. And I expect that to be the case in 2024 and beyond. I think the Mexican electorate has been underestimated as a true force, kind of a rational force to ensure that there is a political equilibrium. But that's, that it's been a long, long road to democracy, and we're still not there in Mexico.
Now, you mentioned in your answer that Morena was formed in 2014, and then 4 years later, in 2018, a member of Morena, as we mentioned, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, got elected president. In an American context, the idea of forming a major political party and then having a member of that party be elected president 4 years after its formation, that seems like something that couldn't happen in the U.S. So what is it about Morena and Mr. López Obrador in particular, and what is it about the Mexican system that allowed a political party to be developed and then have its leader elected president 4 years later?
Well, I think we have to remember that Mr. López Obrador ran for office 3 times. He was mayor of Mexico City in the year 2000 through 2005. Then he ran for office under the PRD banner. He lost that election by about 0.4% of the vote. So that's when Calderon got elected in 2006. Then he ran again in 2012. That's when the PRI came back to power under Peña Nieto. And then he ran again in 2018. But because in the PRD, he was seen as a loser, he was seen as a bad bet. He, in 2014, decided to exit the PRD and found his own political party. So what happened there is that he took a lot of the PRI membership and a lot of the PRD membership into Morena. So Morena wasn't founded as a small political party. It was founded as a coalition put together by him as a very large figure in early 21st century Mexican politics. So with that kind of background, he was very quick to mobilize Morena and a lot of the other people that he kind of poached away from other political parties. There was also a lot of discontent in Mexico among the poor, because even though Mexico was growing, its economy was modernizing, there were still about 40 to 45% of people who were not really enjoying any of the benefits of a modern economy, that were still very poor. And there was a lot of social resentment. And I think in his political campaign, but all of them really, 06, 12, and 18, he was able to get a lot of these poor people to believe that he would actually make a difference and revindicate them in the political system. It hasn't happened that way, by the way. Poverty in Mexico in 2023, almost at the end of his administration, in 24 remains the same. In fact, extreme poverty has actually increased. So there are some issues. I don't think he's been able to accomplish what he said. There's more corruption, more violence. Mexico is in a much more difficult position today. And so certainly his promises meant absolutely nothing. But there's a lot of resentment in Mexican society still there, simmering bit by bit. And a lot of the opposition political parties are the object of that resentment. And so Mr. López Obrador has been able to really ride that resentment. He's a populist. So he built his movement, Morena, over a couple of decades. It wasn't something that just emerged all of a sudden. But then he founded the party, gave it a name, and brought all these people in, became kind of a more open populist, and got elected in 2018.
Well, and you said
I want to add, though, I wonder if Morena will survive Mr. Lopez Obrador's departure, not just from power, but he's deaf, right? I mean, he's a sickly man. I don't think he's going to live a very long time. He's got very serious heart problems and so on. I think once he's gone, Morena is a very unruly political party. It's not fully institutionalized, and so I wonder if it'll survive.
Well, now going back to when he was running and what has actually happened during his administration, you mentioned that he was connecting with people who were feeling economic pain, who were dealing with poverty, and really speaking to those sorts of voters during his campaigns for president. And you said that much of what he laid out, much of what he aspired to accomplish as a candidate has not come to fruition, or at least the results have not been there during his administration. What are some of the specific reforms, though, that he advocated for as a candidate? And what are some of the specific reforms that he and his administration have attempted during his time in office?
Well, his promises were always very vague. If you look at the presidential debates and the interviews that he gave between 2006 and 2017, before the 2018 elections, he never really specified any programs, any legislation that he would push for. He simply spoke in broad terms about inequality and poverty and corruption and crime and violence. And people, sort of understood that language. I think he articulated many of the concerns of the Mexican electorate and the Mexican public. People saw him as a potential savior from many of the very important difficulties that they were facing on a daily basis. The violence that surged under the Calderon administration, the poverty of neoliberalism, as he called it, the inequality and the social resentment that had emerged in Mexico over the years, in a society that is very much a class system society still to this day. So he made a lot of promises that, he would take Mexico to the promised land, so to speak. I mean, at the end of his fifth year, which is this month, actually, he took office in December. So in a couple of months, it'll be his fifth year. And where is Mexico today? Economic growth has stalled, partly because of the pandemic, and he refused to invest any funding in maintaining businesses open like many other countries did. He has not implemented a serious tax reform to create a more progressive tax system where the rich pay more and the poor pay less. That certainly didn't happen. And you know that one of the best ways to redistribute wealth in a country is through the tax system. He didn't do that. And then I think overlearned the lessons of the Calderon administration on crime, organized crime, violence in Mexico. And he spoke of hugs, not bullets, as a strategy towards organized crime. He was not going to face them down, confront them the way Calderon did, his arch enemy Calderon, of course. And the result has been that Mexico today is more violent, crime riddled, and the cartels are more powerful, and there's many more. And 70% of Mexicans today, according to the latest poll, are feel insecure, unsafe in the country, and 40% of them say that they would leave the country if they could. They would migrate to another country. So he didn't address the issue of violence and organized crime that people expected him to. He didn't address the inequality through a tax reform system. He tried to address poverty through cash transfers, but he made some serious mistakes. One of them, for example, was to do away with a more nuanced roster poor people in the country and say, okay, this particular person makes very little money. They're going to receive a subsidy, a cash transfer from the government. And then this person makes more money, so they're going to receive less. And then this person is rich. They're not going to receive anything. Instead, he did away with all that and began to distribute these cash transfers. Anybody over 60. But it didn't make a difference if that person was rich or poor. So an age-based cash transfer obviously is more unequal because somebody who's over 60 may be poor, but they may also be rich. And so if your only criterion to transfer the money is that they're over 60, well, you're going to end up handing cash to people who don't need it, and perhaps depriving people who do need it from additional money. So he made those kinds of mistakes like that. He's also a populist politically. I think he attacked Mexico's institutions. He weakened the electoral system. He got in a big spat with the Supreme Court. He treated Congress as a kind of an instrumental branch or arm of his administration. He fought with the governors. He refused to invest in infrastructure. Mexico's infrastructure today is in trouble. He hasn't really managed the immigration crisis very well. I think Mr. López Obrador turned out to be, to kind of summarize it, a great candidate, but a very poor governor. In other words, a very poor public policy figure who can really brought about effective change. And I think that's he'll be remembered as as somebody who really found an echo in the Mexican public on the many problems that ail Mexico today, but who, once in power, was unable to address them effectively. And I think that's going to be his legacy.
Well, that's an interesting summation of his legacy. But a couple of issues that you've mentioned multiple times I want to return back to. You provided some statistics and some context on the violence issue in Mexico, but can you talk a little bit more about violence and the role of organized crime in Mexico? And then you've also mentioned corruption as being a significant problem multiple times. Can you talk about that issue in a little more detail as well?
Well, they're two different things, but they're kind of related, right? Let me talk about organized crime first. Organized crime in Mexico, it has been there for a very long time. You have to remember, organized crime in Mexico operates very much in sync with U.S. policy. You cannot understand organized crime in Mexico without talking about the United States. If you go back 100 years to prohibition in the United States, alcohol prohibition, when that occurred in the United States, given the domestic circumstances at that time, the cultural wars in the United States at that time, one of the things that was clear is that many Mexican groups emerged to provide alcohol. Then when alcohol became legal in the United States again, smuggling of alcohol into the U.S., moonshining and all that stuff that was going on in Mexico to provide, and all the different bars and clubs that emerged along the U.S.-Mexico border to provide Americans with the alcohol to party. This is how Tijuana and Juarez and other towns on the border came to be known back in the 20s and 30s as kind of party towns for Americans who wanted a playground and wanted alcohol. But that sort of began to structure organized crime. And then when alcohol became legal in the United States again in the 30s, they moved on to marijuana. And so there was marijuana cultivation in Mexico in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. Lots of fields in states like Chihuahua and Guerrero and Sinaloa and other places where these cartels then began to specialize on marijuana primarily. And then in the 80s, cocaine coming in from Colombia. And then, of course, opioids back in the 60s, all the way through today. And then today, fentanyl, right? So you have to understand that a lot of the organized criminal activity in Mexico is really related to U.S. prohibitionist policies. A lot of those criminal organizations in Mexico really shaped themselves around the provision of these goods, drugs, and such that are in demand in the United States. And then there's also contraband going the other way. When Mexico was a very closed economy back in the mid 20th century, people smuggled electrodomestics, vehicles, and other kinds of things into Mexico. Prohibition always leads to black markets, in other words. So you cannot think about that without the binational dynamics. The problem today in Mexico, I think, in the last few years, and especially under the López Obrador administration, because he's kind of given them a pass and not really confronted organized crime, is that they have diversified and expanded into Mexican society and gained control of territories. So they're now into extortion, vehicle theft, natural resource theft, and kidnapping and drug trafficking and human smuggling and human trafficking. And so these organizations are growing. So they're no longer exclusively related to American markets. They're still doing that, obviously. Fentanyl is one example. But they're now victimizing Mexicans in Mexico. There's a lot of criminal activity going on in Mexico itself. And I think that is what scares a lot of people. And I think Mr. López Obrador has allowed that to flourish. So we have to understand these dynamics as binational, but also now as domestic in Mexico. And that's why a lot of people feel very insecure. Now, organized crime in Mexico flourished because institutions are weak. The police is corrupt. Politicians themselves have been known to take money from organized crime to look the other way, to allow them to operate. And I think, unfortunately, this is exactly what's happening today. Politicians are engaged in with criminal organizations themselves in strange alliances. In fact, I think one of the most concerning things about Morena, the president's political party today, is that I think the president sees Morena as an instrument, not as an institution. It's a political party that he founded, but he really doesn't care what happens to Morena, by the way. I don't think there's a disconnect between what the president thinks and the political party that he founded and has instrumentally taken him to power. And I think Morena now has shown that it's got a kind of an ersatz coalition with organized crime, and organized crime mobilized in their favor in elections in the states of Guerrero and Michoacán and Sinaloa, Nayarit, Baja California, and Sonora. So there's other places where Morena, the political party, is in cahoots with organized crime, and there's a symbiotic relationship between organized crime and that political party. It's a very dangerous moment for Mexico because it means that organized crime is discovering its political interests. And that's, I think, when they become more akin to terrorist organizations rather than just simply mafias. I think Mexico is entering into a place where it's going to be very difficult to walk back. It's a dangerous time. And so corruption, I think, sustains, fuels, maintains, greases the machinery of politicians in Mexico. And I think Morena has proven to be quite an ally of organized crime. And that's a very concerning thing for those of us who are observers of Mexico.
Well, in the U.S., to go back to the issue of organized crime and cartels, probably the best known drug cartel is the Sinaloa cartel. And the most prominent figure associated with the drug cartels is the now incarcerated El Chapo. So how does the Sinaloa cartel and how does El Chapo fit into this picture? What should Americans or anyone else who's listening to this know about that particular cartel in the broader context of organized crime in Mexico?
Well, I think the Sinaloa cartel is an organization, and it's older than El Chapo. El Chapo is just one lieutenant within the Sinaloa cartel. I think he may not even be the main guy. He's obviously a very important lieutenant. He's been a very important figure in the Sinaloa cartel. But clearly, El Chapo has been extradited a few years back. He's been in prison and then escaped, and then in prison again, and then escaped again, and then finally got extradited to the United States. And now his son has been just extradited this past weekend on September 15th, 2023, to the United States. And the Sinaloa cartel continues. The Sinaloa cartel is an organization that has been able to adapt very quickly from a rather hierarchical organization into more of a federation of groups that operate in coordination in various illegal businesses. They're still largely focused on drug trafficking. Evidently, fentanyl has been the one big thing, but they've been very adept at adjusting to new circumstances, at surviving different political administrations, at surviving attacks from the Mexican government under the Calderon administration, and obviously in surviving U.S. efforts to combat them. Other organizations, I think, have come and gone. Los Zetas is one of them. They practically disappeared. I think when they turned on the Mexican public, I think the government made them a priority and really hammered them until they broke down and almost disappeared. There's still small fragments of it. But the Sinaloa cartel has a social base in the state of Sinaloa. People like them, protect them. When El Chapo Guzman, for example, was captured, people protested in Culiacan, Sinaloa, because they see him as kind of a local hero. When he escaped, people celebrated. So it's got a more social base than other cartels. It's more resilient. It's more adaptable. It's, I guess, more plastic, and has been able to survive. We now have other cartels, the Jalisco Nueva Generación, which is a relatively new cartel, also an amalgamation of various groups that have come together in central and western Mexico. And then we have the Northeast Cartel out in Tamaulipas, which is also an amalgamation of other groups. But the Sinaloa cartel has proven to be quite resilient, and I think that's what made them survive. So this kingpin strategy by the United States, capturing capos like El Chapo and extraditing them and taking them into American high security prisons and keeping them hasn't really made a difference. I mean, if you think about the drug war, you have to think of it as a failed effort because, 20 years ago, there were 10,000 people dead in the United States by overdoses, and now there's 110,000 by fentanyl. So clearly, if you just go by the numbers, this is not paying off. We have the wrong strategy, and I think we push Mexico into a kingpin strategy that is capturing capos, thinking that what lies beneath them, the structure, will fall apart, and it doesn't. There's always somebody else, some lieutenant who takes over. And so I wouldn't say that El Chapo is even that important, and proof of it is the fact that he's in prison. He's been in prison for a few years now, and the Sinaloa cartel continues to prosper and do enormously profitable business, fentanyl being one of them.
If you're an aspiring podcaster, then joining Podcasters Paradise is an absolute must. Podcasters Paradise is a premium membership community that will help you create, grow, and monetize your podcast. With step-by-step video tutorials, resources, and templates, and daily support via the private Facebook group, Podcasters Paradise is the best place to learn how to be a successful podcaster. Joining Podcasters Paradise has helped me with my podcast in so many ways. It is truly a tremendous resource. Plus, as an added bonus, if you join Podcasters Paradise through my link, then after you launch your podcast, I will mention on my show and link to your podcast from placesandprofiles.com, as long as your podcast is not inappropriate and is not significantly opposed to my beliefs and values. Check out Podcasters Paradise and get started on your podcasting journey today by going to placesandprofiles.com/paradise. Again, that's placesandprofiles.com/paradise. Now, we've obviously talked about the role of U.S.-Mexico relations in the context of the drug war and organized crime with the last few topics that have come up here. But what are some of the other places where we see the significance of U.S.-Mexico relations in Mexican politics? Obviously, in the U.S., the border and immigration are places where we see U.S.-Mexico relations affecting political dialogue in the U.S. What are some of the places, though, where we see the impact of the relations between these two countries in a Mexican context?
Well, you have to remember that Mexico and the United States have a very complicated history, going back to the origins of both countries and eventually the clash in which the United States took about half of the Mexican territory, the Californias, the New Mexico territories, and of course Texas, very large swaths of land that the United States pushed Mexico back across the Rio Grande and took that land, which was largely empty anyway. But in any case, this has a really seared in the Mexican psyche. I mean, Mexicans know that. So it's been a controversial relationship for many years. I think in the 20th century as well. Mexico was with the United States during the Cold War, but also good relations with Cuba and good relations with the Soviet Union. So Mexico has maintained some distance to kind of assert its sovereignty and its independence from the United States. But the two countries today, due to their neighborhood, their vicinity, of course, but also largely to some institutional arrangements like NAFTA, now known as the USMCA, have become largely intertwined. I mean, if you think about the United States, more Americans claim Mexican ancestry today than any other group except Germans. If you look at the Mexican ancestry record in the United States, it is enormous. We're talking 40 million Americans who today claim some kind of Mexican ancestry. 12 million are, of course, born in Mexico. So it's a very large number. Mexico has been one of the major contributors to U.S. population growth. Lots of immigration, lots of Americans live in Mexico today. So the State Department estimates about 1 million, maybe some people say that as many as 2 million Americans now live in Mexico, from the Baja Peninsula to the Bajío region to Guadalajara to Mexico City. So who knows how many Americans live in Mexico? Of course, tourism. Tens of millions of Mexicans visit the United States every year. Tens of millions of Americans visit Mexico every year. The USMCA today, I think, is the last numbers I saw recently is trade between the two countries is reaching $800 billion a year. Within the next couple of years, if nearshoring continues to occur, that is the repatriation of manufacturing from Asia to North America, and many of them going to Mexico, I'm guessing that trade will reach $1 trillion a year within the next few years. That's a very intense relationship. There's obviously the bad things to immigration, especially because Mexico is used as a transit point for a lot of irregular migration coming in from the Caribbean and South America, and even a little bit from other countries as well, Africa, Middle East, etc. But mostly the Caribbean and Central America, and of course, drugs like fentanyl and the border management and traffic and all the stuff that occurs. It's such an intense relationship. I would say that no two other countries in the world are more intertwined for good and bad, for a productive relationship, but also a very acrimonious set of moments in history than Mexico and the United States. I mean, these are two neighbors. They are kind of almost condemned to being neighbors for in a sometimes uncomfortable and sometimes very easy relationship. I would say that for the United States, Mexico is the most consequential country. Of course, other countries matter. Russia matters, and China matters, and Europe matters, and on and on. But on a day-to-day basis, due to the intensity of the relationship and the many threads that run back and forth across the border on so many issues, Mexico is the most consequential country for tens of millions of Americans. And that, I think, is not going to go away. That will continue to be the case And I think what we need to do is to have a much broader framework of cooperation on many more issues than trade. Trade is going fine. Investment is going fine. Economic exchanges are going fine. Legal human mobility is going fine. But we have a lot of other problems that we need to solve, and we just haven't found the right framework.
Yeah, and two issues that you discussed there, and two issues that are in many ways at the heart of this relationship are trade, as you touched on, and immigration. How have those issues affected internal Mexican politics, changes in trade policy with NAFTA, later the USMCA, and then all of the controversy surrounding immigration in the US to the US? How have those affected internal Mexican politics in recent years?
Well, they're two different things, right? I mean, let me discuss immigration first, because I think it's it's a thing unto itself, often unrelated to the economic relationship, because immigrants can be from the Caribbean, from Central America, from South America, and beyond. I think in the 20th century, we saw a lot of Mexican migration. Again, history matters. If you look at the history of Mexican migration, back in the 1900s, when the U.S. and Mexico established the border as it stands today, Mexicans continued to go back and forth freely across the border. The border was not really guarded. It was an open border. There were markers, obviously, but nothing really in terms of physical barriers that could prevent people to go back and forth from going back and forth, that is. And then the Mexican Revolution saw a first wave of Mexicans. That's about 110 years ago. First wave of Mexicans into the United States. Lots of people settling in Arizona and California and Texas. And then in the 1930s, when the United States was in the grip of the Great Recession, the Great Depression, really, as it is known. 500,000 Mexicans got expelled back into Mexico, even though they were born in the United States and they were citizens. But then World War II came, and at that moment, the U.S. needed Mexican labor, so they established the Bracero program, and Mexicans began to flow back into the United States by the millions. Some 5 million Mexicans probably participated in the Bracero program between the 40s and the 60s when the program ended. By that time, the roots were well established. The relationships among employers and workers were already well established, and Mexican migration continued to grow through the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. And then, of course, all the border enforcement that came in the 1990s after NAFTA was passed. But by that time, there were already tens of millions of Mexicans living in the United States, working in the United States, going back and forth. I think the physical barriers along the border only increased the Mexican workers in the United States, even undocumented workers, because in the past there was something called circular migration. People would come and work and go back home, come and work and go back home. Once you establish physical barriers and force the border and increase the penalties, then people who successfully made it across the border just simply stayed in the United States. So that added to the Mexican population in the United States. And then Mexican migration slowed to a trickle and practically to net zero by 2007. Other migration from Central America in the 90s grew from El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, a few other countries kind of began to grow, going through Mexico. And now we see Mexicans migrating again, by the way. I mean, the border crisis today involves a lot of Mexicans who are now leaving Mexico, some legally investing in the United States, moving their families to the United States by various visa paths, and others without papers because the situation in Mexico is complicated today. So Mexican migration has been a constant. It goes up and down. It shifts and changes, but at the end of the day, it's been a constant. And I think, in the future, what we need to do is to figure out orderly and legal ways to integrate labor markets in North America. That's a pending issue between the two countries. But it's been a very difficult situation, as you saw under the Trump administration. And the Biden administration, with all these hundreds of thousands of irregular migrants from other countries using Mexico, going through up to the border and asking for asylum, that's the whole theater going on the border, what we see in Texas as well, with Governor Abbott taking advantage of that. So politicians in the United States, especially Republicans, I think often don't want to solve the problem. They just want to maintain the problem because I think it's electorally profitable for them. So I see it that way. I'm not sure where the Democrats stand. They obviously haven't solved it, but the Republicans have certainly made a big political point out of it. In regards to trade and the economic relationship, well, that's there and that's intense, and that is actually the one thing that is going very well and that orders the binational relationship, and everyone talks about it. I mean, from California to Michigan, from Ohio to Georgia, and from Texas to Arizona, lots of industry, lots of manufacturing, lots of investment. That's going quite well. That's a success story of economic integration. Again, labor markets is a pending thing, but that touches on immigration, which is controversial in the United States. So all these things are very intense. I expect the economic relationship to grow at a faster pace, particularly after the Russian-Ukrainian war and the U.S.-China rivalry on trade and economic issues. Mexico will be one of the beneficiaries. In fact, I think investment in Mexico is now growing. It's reached a record of $25 billion this year. And I think it'll grow. It's still not where it should be, by the way. I think it can be much greater. But given Mexican policy and hostility towards business, I think it's not where it should be. The problem with the López Obrador administration is that it has implemented the USMCA very tentatively. He certainly doesn't want to open the energy sector. That's one that remains largely closed with a bit of investment here and there. But if he implemented the 2013-2014 energy reform, Mexico would be booming today with all kinds of energy investment. He doesn't want to do that. He's a nationalist. He's a populist nationalist, and he doesn't want to open that sector. He wants to continue the Mexican government tradition of two large energy companies, the electricity utility and the oil company, to be the main actors in Mexico's energy markets. I think that's unsustainable. That's going to end. But that's where he stands. And of course, the new dispute is GMO corn. He has the belief that genetically modified foodstuffs are harmful to health, despite the evidence. And of course, American farmers flood the Mexican market with tons and tons of grain, wheat, rice, beans, corn. And he wants to stop that. He thinks that it's done a lot of damage to the Mexican agricultural industry. And being a nationalist, I think he intends to restart the Mexican agricultural sector. I don't think he's done it. I don't think he can. I don't think it's feasible, but it's engaging the U.S. and Mexico in yet another trade dispute. So there are rocky points, but at the end of the day, economics has its own logic, and I think it's a success story despite these disputes.
All right. A few more things that I want to touch on quickly before we wrap up for today. And I want to turn most of the remainder of our conversation back towards internal Mexican issues. And I want to next take a look at the status and role of indigenous people in Mexico. This has obviously been a very significant issue in Mexico, in Mexican politics for generations. What is the current situation with indigenous people in Mexico? What are some of the issues that they face today in Mexico and in the Mexican political system?
Well, I mean, I teach back in Ciudad Juarez when I go. I teach a class called North American Society and Thought. And one of the things that the students are always most surprised about is the lectures on indigenous peoples, right? The First Nations of Canada, Native Americans in the United States, and indigenous peoples in Mexico, as they are all three called, are in a terrible situation. I mean, they obviously were colonized. The Europeans came in, they settled. Whether they pushed them out, like in the United States, into reservations in New Mexico and Oklahoma and other places, or whether they I guess became sort of intertwined with the population, like in Spain, or whether they were also given certain territories, like in Canada. At the end of the day, the situation of Native Americans or the native populations in North America is the same. They suffer from many of the same things: femicides, violence, alcoholism, poverty, inequality, they're confined to certain spaces, a kind of a cultural oppression by the hegemonic cultures. I think in that case, in that sense, Mexico is probably not any different. The only thing is that in Mexico, the indigenous population is about 29-30% of the population, as opposed to the smaller pockets in Canada and the United States. And so in Mexico, they're a substantial group. And so it's very difficult to address them as a minority. They're really not a minority. When you're talking about 30% of 130 million people, you're talking about 30 plus million people, 35 million people. And so it's not a small group. And it also depends, right? Some of them are living in communities that they've actually built according to their customs. For example, the Zapatistas in Chiapas, have created their own municipalities, and they live according to their own rules. There are others. There are more blended with a regular population, like in Hidalgo and Puebla and other places like that. And then there's others that have remained largely isolated and even hardly speak Spanish, like the Tarahumaras in Chihuahua, for example. So it depends where you look at it. But in general, I think they're marginalized and they're poor, and it's very difficult to reivindicate them. The one president that I think was very aware of indigenous populations and tried to penetrate into those communities and take some help, development help to them, and acknowledge them as such, was Vicente Fox. The indigenous law that was passed in the early 2000s recognized 68 different indigenous populations, each with their own language, each with their own customs, each with their own recognized membership and such, and then try to integrate it. Xochitl Galvez, who's now running for office by the PAN PRI-PRD coalition, was recruited by the Fox administration in the early 2000s to shepherd that legislation through Congress in Mexico, and also to work with indigenous communities to kind of assess their needs for development. And so she has this long-standing tradition of working with indigenous communities. But at the end of the day, I think in North America in general, and Mexico in particular, we haven't yet found the way to really truly reivindicate these communities that have been here for many more centuries than we have.
All right, so 3 more questions before we wrap up, and we will definitely return to the upcoming Mexican presidential election at the end. I definitely want to come back to that, since you've mentioned Xochitl Galvez a couple of times, mentioned Claudia Sheinbaum towards the beginning as well. But earlier you were talking about some of the issues in Mexico and some of the unfulfilled promises, unfulfilled accomplishments on the part of the AMLO administration on things such as organized crime, violence, poverty. An issue that I didn't really hear you mention, though, was healthcare. What is the current status of healthcare and medical care in Mexico? And how has the administration of Mr. Lopez Obrador of AMLO addressed this issue, especially given that the COVID-19 situation popped up while he was serving as president?
Mr. Lopez Obrador is quite bad at public policy. Mexico had a relatively functioning healthcare system. It was fragmented; not everybody was covered. I mean, but some of the healthcare system segments were associated with employment. The IMSS, which was the national security system, social security system, and then the ISSSTE, which was a different system, and then the state systems. And then Mr. Calderon, when he was president, created a kind of an Obamacare style Social Security, where people could actually pay and buy into the existing systems to receive health care. At that point, almost 100% of the Mexican population was covered, maybe 90%, 95% were covered. Mr. Lopez Obrador has starved the healthcare system. It's in shambles. It's falling apart. It's understaffed. It's underfinanced. Its technology is now obsolete. Its protocols. Mexico had achieved an incredible rate of vaccination. Now there are no vaccinations. He refused to invest in the healthcare system. He tried to create a parallel healthcare system. It didn't work. They replaced it with yet another system. It didn't work. They eliminated the Obamacare style insurance, and they didn't replace it with anything. So if there were 10, 15 million Mexicans who didn't have health coverage when he took office, there are now 60 million Mexicans who have no health care coverage at all. So it's in a bad place. He refused to acknowledge that the pandemic was a serious issue, and the result was that Mexico is one of the most affected countries by the pandemic. About 700,000 to 800,000 people died as a result of the pandemic. The United States was pretty bad too, by the way. We lost about 1 million people, but it's a much larger country. We're talking about 330 million people. In Mexico, 130 million, and 700,000 to 800,000 people dead on an occasion of the pandemic. So it's just a terrible legacy again in healthcare. I think the next administration is going to have to rethink Mexico's healthcare system altogether, because Mr. Lopez Obrador has done nothing but destroyed it.
Well, and before we take a look at what that next administration could be, I do want to go back to one more economic issue. We've talked about tourism a little bit and trade policy, but how about oil and energy? What role do those industries play in the Mexican economy, and what is the significance of Pemex in the context of those industries?
Well, Pemex is the national oil company, and it's wrapped into the whole idea of nationalism, and the president views it that way. But it's unsustainable. Mexico doesn't have as much oil as people think. It's not going to work. The government doesn't have the technology or the finances to invest in Pemex and keep it alive. Pemex is a heavily indebted company, $120 billion in debt. It's a broke company. It's completely broke. It's not going to work. It's not going to provide sufficient. It's actually setting Mexico's clock on climate change back. Mexico is falling back on coal, on oil, on hydrocarbons, and things like that. It's simply not going to work. His energy policy is not going to work. The next administration will have to reconsider and probably turn to renewables, which Mexico can. If it allows private investment into renewables, Mexico can certainly get all the electricity it wants and can and needs if that's the case. But as long as there's a nationalistic policy around it, I think the energy sector in Mexico will probably continue to set Mexico's clock back on its contributions to addressing climate change, and probably not be sufficient to provide the energy that Mexico needs.
All right, and we've teased this topic several times, and this seems like a good place to conclude our conversation for today. But next year, there is going to be a presidential election in Mexico. At the very beginning, you talked about the candidates a little bit. Xochitl Gálvez and Claudia Sheinbaum are the two candidates that you've mentioned by name so far. What should someone who's listening to this episode who doesn't live in Mexico, what should they know about Claudia Sheinbaum, about Xochitl Gálvez, and what to expect from the 2024 Mexican presidential election?
Claudia Sheinbaum was mayor of Mexico City. She is a protege of Mr. Lopez Obrador. She is his handpicked successor. He put up a charade of a primary election within the Morena party. He allowed other people to run in the primary, but at the end of the day, everyone knew that Sheinbaum was his chosen successor. He certainly put the thumb on the scale and tilted every thing he could in her favor. This is why I think Morena currently has a schism within the political party. it's a complicated situation. She's kind of a gray candidate, I would say. She's not very inspiring. She's not very articulate. She's educated, I think, in California, and she is a scientist of sorts. But it's very difficult to tell what Scheinbaum really believes, because she parrots everything that Mr. López Obrador says, and she's not likely to step away from anything he does or says today. I mean, she is his protege. She is, I guess, somebody that he believes will carry his legacy, whatever that may be. I think is a terrible legacy. So Morena is in a complicated place because they have a candidate that's less than optimal. What is Scheinbaum's best asset? López Obrador. He's going to do everything possible to get her elected, including using public resources, illegally campaigning for her, and trying to prop her up and trying to mobilize people in her favor. So it's very difficult to disentangle Scheinbaum from López Obrador. That's, I think, a disadvantage. And I also think that they're underestimating the Mexican electorate's ability to just simply say no after he's done. So I think it's complicated for her, because that's who she is, and then it's very difficult for her to break away from any of the failed policies of the López Obrador administration. So that's her situation. Xochitl Galvez, 4 months ago, nobody knew who she was. She was a senator for the PAN party, even though she's not a member of the party. She caucuses with the PAN, so she's more identified with that political party. But at the end of the day, the three political parties lined up behind her. There was also a primary election in that party. Slowly, the different candidates dropped out in her favor, because she's an indigenous woman from the state of Hidalgo. She's somebody who grew up very, very poor in a very poor village in Mexico. Her father was an alcoholic as a kid. She sold stuff in the streets to help her family make ends meet. She moved to Mexico City when she was a teenager, went to the university, National Autonomous University, and studied engineering, and then founded a company that is dedicated to building smart buildings, high tech. And then she was recruited under the Fox administration to address some of the indigenous communities' issues back in the early 2000s. That's how she became a politician, and now she's a senator. She connects well with women. She connects well with those who are disaffected by the López Obrador administration. She seems to be galvanizing a lot of the I guess, uncertainties and anxieties of the middle class, and some people who just are disappointed with López Obrador. So I think it's a race. Maybe 5 months ago I would have said it's 100-0, and now it's more like 60-40. Xochitl is still probably the underdog, but I think she's ready and pretty good to give a fight, put up a fight. And I think in Mexico, interestingly, we now have a race, and a very interesting race. So we'll see how that goes. But these are two women, each with their unique characteristics. And by the way, Xochitl doesn't have any of the flanks open. Mr. López Obrador cannot accuse her of being a privileged woman, a conservative from the upper class or the middle class. Quite the contrary. I mean, she's an indigenous woman who rose from sheer poverty all the way to the Mexican Senate. And so she doesn't have all the vulnerabilities that Mr. López Obrador is good at identifying and using to his advantage. And in the meantime, he's got a rather gray candidate on his side, and he's practically going to have to run the campaign himself. So there's a fight now in Mexico. So it's very interesting. And within 3 months, things turned around. And so we'll have a very exciting 2024 election.
Well, and you seem to suggest there that Ms. Scheinbaum, despite some of her problems, we could say, is still the favorite. Do you think that she'll end up winning, or is it too far away to really be able to make a prediction?
I think she's got about 40% preference in the latest poll that I saw. And then Xochitl Galvez, within 3.5 months, has climbed to about 36%. So she's still, or 35%. So she's still down, but 20 to 25% of Mexicans have said, I don't know yet. I can't yet say. I think the thing with Claudia Sheinbaum is that she's reached the peak. Her preferences are probably between 40 and 45%. I don't think she has much more room to grow. Xochitl Galvez has grown from 0 to 35% with a lot more room to grow, and 20% of Mexicans still saying we don't know. So I think it's a race. It's open. It's an open race. So I don't know. I wouldn't say that.
Okay, well, it'll certainly be interesting to follow then. Before we part ways and end this conversation for today, if someone wants to learn more about these sorts of topics we've been discussing today, or if someone wants to read or follow some of your work, where would you recommend they take a look? What resources or websites would you suggest?
Well, they can go to the Baker Institute website at Rice University, and of course, within that, they'll find the U.S.-Mexico Center, and that's where most of our publications, including my Baker Institute related publications, are listed. Yeah.
All right, perfect. So we will have links to all of that, of course, on the show notes page for today's episode, which is placesinprofiles.com/12. So placesinprofiles.com/12 is the place to go for today's episode. And Tony, I want to thank you for being so generous with your time this morning, for agreeing to come on the podcast and having this conversation with me. This was fascinating. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of the Places and Profiles podcast. Please visit placesandprofiles.com to subscribe and listen to more episodes. Come back again soon, and thanks for listening.